On the evening of November 13th, 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr. enters Henry's bar in Amityville and calls out to the crowd, "You gotta help me. I think my mother and father are shot." Inside the home at 112 Ocean Avenue, DeFeo's entire family is found dead. All of the victims are lying face down in bed. The perpetrator? The only lone survivor, Ronald DeFeo Jr. himself. On June 21st, 1975, DeFeo was found guilty of 6 counts of second-degree murder. In December of 1975, the Lutzes, a family of 5, move into the DeFeo house, fully aware that the low price of $80,000 they are paying for the 3-story colonial house is because of the gruesome murders that have taken place there. 28 days later, the Lutzes move out, claiming unbearable paranormal harassment. What really happened during those 28 days is debated. Was the house haunted by the ghosts of the DeFeo family? That's what the Lutzes and Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s lawyer, William Weber, wanted the world to think. Was it all a fabricated hoax? Evidence seems to indicate that this might be true. Today, we separate the facts from film fiction of the Amityville Horror.
Hi, we're Kelly,
Molly,
And Bronwyn.
and welcome to This Might Be True. Today, we're looking at the 1979 film The Amityville Horror, directed by Stuart Rosenberg.
Alrighty, folks. So this is kicking off our Halloween-themed episode. We had some brainstorming sessions and wanted to give you some, content to help celebrate this season.
Spooky
season. Yeah, we've done true crime. We've done other topics, but this is our first true horror movie. So I thought, let's talk a little bit about our thoughts of the film, our reactions. When did we first see it? And I'll admit, this was a newish film for me. I think I maybe saw it a few years ago when The Conjuring was out, because I kind of was curious about the sort of origins. But horror is not my thing, to be frank. In terms of being an academic and what I teach, I do enjoy teaching it more than I used to, but it was something I kind of avoided for a lot of my academic career. But whenever it's the fall semester, I do a horror film, and I try to time it around Halloween as much as possible. And in terms of my love of horror, it wasn't really there growing up. I did see, Blair Witch Project and other notable films that came out in my childhood, but it really wasn't until I was in grad school. I took a really great class taught by Kimberly Montaigne, who actually got her PhD at NYU, and then she was working as a sessional at UBC, and it was on teen cinema. And that was really cool because we started with the invention of the teenager, and then we did a whole unit on 70s, 80s horror movies. And
Because what's a
that's
horror
really-
without teenagers? That's the thing. It
Exactly,
goes together.
yeah.
Often that horror films center around adolescence and teen experience.
So Kelly, I'm really curious, why did you want to choose this film of all the options from this era? Because there are a lot of great horror movies from the 70s and
Yeah.
80s.
You're right. And it is such a the 70s and 80s were so good for horror in general, and I think just a lot of social anxieties. And I think the reason I really wanted to choose this film was because of what it mixes in, because I love true crime. So there's this true crime element. There is an actual true crime at the heart of this story. What happened in that house, there is an element of truth, there's an element of what is true and what isn't true, what's a hoax, what's real. But the crime itself that happened, the DeFeo crime and the family that was murdered in this house, that happened. And I always kind of got drawn in by that. But then you have this whole other thing, this mystery, this insane story around the Lutzes in this house and this supposed haunted situation that only seem to affect them and no one else that's ever lived in the house. And I just think it's really fascinating. There's an enduring popularity of it. There are so many spin-offs to the Amityville Horror because it's a true story. So it's actually, they couldn't copyright it in the way you could, because these murders did happen. This place is real. They couldn't copyright it, and therefore it's left it open to so many interpretations and so many films. But yeah, as of 2025, there are 35 films that have been produced with widely varying degrees of connection to the events depicted in the original film. And I just think the legacy of it is because there is it real or is it not? And you can fall on either side of that camp depending on what you believe in, what you choose to believe in. And, I think that's going to be a really fun discussion to have today. Like, did it happen?
And I mean, Brahman, you're the expert on the event. I know you, again, we watched the film recently-ish. What were your initial reactions to it, especially in light of some of the research you've been doing? Do you have any opening thoughts before we dive deeper into it?
Well, maybe I should just break down in terms of what might be true of the actual, as Kelly said, the background of this film is an actual real murder. So that is the one thing that we know in terms of like, it is fact. This did actually happen. It is true. There's a point in time where things start to go a little bit off the rails, and that is not so easy to verify. And then you kind of come back around to things that we can substantiate, like a book was published and a movie was made. So let's go back to November 13th, 1974, in a suburban neighborhood of Amityville on Long Island in New York. And Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr. goes into a bar in Amityville and says, "You gotta help me. I think my mother and father are shot."
Can you imagine being at the bar that day? You're just having a beer.
And it was 6:30 p.m. So it wasn't like this. You're thinking like it's 11 o'clock. The bar is rowdy. I mean, I can't imagine how many people were probably in the bar at 6:30. I made a note to myself here. I'm like, the whole thing just gives Menendez brothers 911 call. Like, if you want to listen to that in the context of like, these people just shot their parents. Like, it's very like, I think my parents have been shot. Like, come on.
Think they might have been shot. I'm not 100% sure, and I didn't check, but hey.
So he did rally a posse of people at the bar, and they all went back to his house and found his parents dead inside. His parents, Ronald and Louise DeFeo, had been shot in bed while they were sleeping, along with their 2 sons and 2 daughters, which I would like to note is like, we don't have that much time to deep dive the actual DeFeo murders in this because we're talking about the stuff that happens after. But that seems like a lot of people to be shot in a house in their beds without realizing what's happening. It's debatable whether or not Butch had some assistance for this.
That's actually something, because they were all found in their beds.
Yeah,
face
down in bed.
Face down. So the sound, that's always something that people talk about in the true crime aspect of it, is why were they not awoken by the sounds of these weapons? It's a loud weapon.
Like, you would think if someone's shot in like the room right next to you, you're gonna be like, whoa, my ears, like guns are really loud. Yeah, so that seems very peculiar for sure.
I guess with it being 1979, perhaps we just didn't have the technology at the time to be able to know if something was in their system, maybe.
Yeah, I don't know. I assume they were doing toxicology, like DNA was down the line. That was like in the 90s, and that sort of came into play. But I don't know if there was ever any done. But yes, as we said, they were all found face down in their beds. They had all been shot with a .35 caliber Marlin 336 rifle at about 3 a.m. that day. So it had been, almost 12 hours had passed before he went into the bar. Butch was arrested.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And it's actually interesting. So initially, Butch, he attempted to say that it was like a hitman and it must have been some kind of like mafia affiliation, which was a really stupid thing to say to the police, because then the police said, "Oh my goodness, you're definitely at risk in your house then, because you're the lone surviving member of this family. They're going to come and try to get you. So we better put you in the police station where you're going to be safe." So then he was just with the police nonstop. So within like 24 hours, he had confessed, when they had proved that the gangster that he said, the mobster, Fellini, he said that it was him. They said he had an alibi, and he essentially confessed. He told detectives, "Once I started, I just couldn't stop. It went so fast." So he admitted that he had...
Where was the lawyer?
always the question. So he admitted that he'd taken a bath after, and he had changed his clothes, and he detailed where he had discarded the evidence, such as the blood-stained clothing, the rifle, the cartridges, before he went to work. His lawyer mounted a defense case of there you go, Molly.
Yeah, the lawyer
there
finally
was one.
enters.
We're gonna get there.
Enters
he
the
did
chat.
get a defense lawyer after confessing to it, so probably not the right chain of events there. So his lawyer wanted to have a defense of insanity. So he was arguing that Butch didn't have any memory of the killing, and he had his own defense psychiatrist that was going to support this as their plea that they were putting in. However, the psychiatrist for the prosecution maintained that DeFeo was a user of heroin and LSD and had antisocial personality disorder, and that he was aware of his actions at the time of the crime. So the judge called the murders, quote, the most heinous murders committed in Suffolk County since its founding. And after a 7-week-long trial, he was convicted with 6 counts of second-degree murder. So that was November 1975 that he was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. And December 1975, George and Kathy Lutz decided to buy the house for the very cheap price of $80,000 and move in with their 3 children and dog. The furniture from the DeFeo house, which you might think you might want to get rid of,
no, thank you,
and start fresh, that was thrown in for just $400.
Oh my God.
So you're like, okay, maybe these people were looking for a nice family home. Maybe the realtor didn't disclose this horrible history and they had no idea. Okay, well, it was a huge, huge, huge crime that everybody knew about. And the guy had just been sentenced a month prior, which definitely would have been in the news.
Right.
Also, yeah, they did totally know, and that was why they bought it, because they knew that it was cheaper because of being a murder house. So they went into this with eyes open. They moved in. They knew that the murders had taken place there. 28 days later, claiming to have been terrorized by paranormal phenomena, they left and never returned, as we see by the title at the end of the film. The events, as the Lutzes reported them, were shared in a book by Jan Anson titled Amityville Horror, A True Story. So
it's true.
It's right
That's
there
done.
in the title. I would like to note the book is referred to as a novel.
Okay.
So
not a
interesting
non-fiction.
to put this might be true right there in the title of your novel.
Of your novel.
It was a bestseller. And yeah, although Anson was essentially just a professional writer that they hired. From my point of view, in terms of the official events of what happened with Amityville, there was a murder, some people moved in, they probably potentially made a whole bunch of stuff up and then left the house that they actually couldn't afford. So yeah, let's take it away, though, with what we see in the film, which is all the details that the Lutzes claim.
And it's interesting if you think about it, because you've got this 1974 is the murders, 75 you've got the Lutzes moving in, 79 is the film. Like, this is a really small window of time. So this is all very
fresh. The book was very, very popular.
It's like you've got then the book, then the film. It's like all bam, bam, bam. It's kind of, I guess, kind of similar to what happens today, where it's like, and the Netflix documentary is coming out. You're like, but it just happened yesterday. So yeah, I mean, we've got the film, the pre-production of the film. I mean, you can imagine this was such a big event, such a talked about thing. Then you've got the book. So the executive producer, Samuel Arkoff, he originated the project. He purchased the rights, and he was going to actually turn it into a television film, which Anson, the writer, had adapted himself, but Arkoff rejected the teleplay, and he reworked it with a screenwriter called Sander Stern, and they reworked it as a feature film. And it's interesting to note that George and Kathy Lutz are listed as story uncredited, so that means they were, I guess, like, harken back to the Bling Ring. Like, did they have some lunches and talk about their, how much were they involved? That's kind of left up to the imagination. But
apparently,
I like
meetings over many bottles of wine.
Oh, there you go. Are we surprised? Okay, first, you know me. It's the tagline. Starts it all. And this one is so good. For God's sake, get out. Or I should try to do it like the voice, that like weird voice in the film talking to the priest. Because doesn't it someone he's just like, get out?
Yeah.
You're
Very
like,
malevolent.
It's very malevolent, which is interesting because, like, I think in today's world, it's subtlety is more scary. Like, it's always more scary if it's more common to normal. Anything that's like slightly off kilter is more frightening than anything that's like just like so openly. And that's something that I think a lot when I rewatch the film. I'm like, oh wow, there's nothing subtle at all. So we have that wonderful tagline, "For God's sake, get out!" exclamation point. So our director Stuart Rosenberg had done, so he'd actually, this was not his first foray into horror or anything, because he'd actually done Alfred Hitchcock Presents in 1959.
That was like the TV show, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Where
That was
Hitchcock
the TV
would
show.
open it. I remember that used to
Exactly.
come on. I think it was on PBS or something when we were growing up. Yeah, yeah.
So fun.
That's an interesting connection. Yeah.
And then he also did The Twilight Zone in 1960. So again, you've got like supernatural, paranormal, spooky stories. And then he did Cool Hand Luke in 1967, which is like a little bit of a shift. But that was definitely like one of his, aside from this, one of like his bigger named films. The cast is really interesting. So James Brolin, who plays George Lutz, James Brolin is married to Barbara Streisand. James Brolin was a well-known actor at that time, particularly 1979, and he said that at the time of his casting, the script was actually unfinished, and so he obtained a copy of the novel, of Anson's novel, and he said he was sitting there at like 2:00 in the morning reading the book, and he'd hung like a pair of pants up in the room, and at a really intense part in the book, the pants just like fell to the floor, and Brolin definitely like isn't someone who speaks about it as like, I am a true believer, but I think that moment he got such a fright, it sort of added to him being like, yeah, I think this has got potential. This could be a really good, like, scary, spooky story to tell. And he thought it would make an effective film, so he agreed to star in it. And he described it as quite a challenge for him because it was such a pure character role. And he hadn't really played anything like that. He said that it demands a progression of dissipation of personality, so he had to figure out how to portray a man who is losing his sanity during his obsession, and we see that throughout the film. He's quite charming, and then he just kind of snaps, and he has these moments where he's like snapping at the kids, at his wife, and you're like, whoa, that's a bit intense. And then, of course, he goes full into like crazy. Then you've got Margot Kidder, who plays Kathy Lutz, and she was known for her role as Lois Lane in the Superman films, which are like the OG Christopher Reeve, so good. If you haven't seen them, they're so fun. It was really interesting because she said that this is how she described like her getting the role. She said basically at that stage, so she's talking about after being in a really big hit like Superman, basically at that stage you took the jobs you were offered and you took the money. Like that's kind of her take of it. But she said horror films are fun to make, they make me laugh. And so she had this kind of different, very different way of approaching it than someone like Brolin, who had read the book, saw the potential. She's more like, why not? That could be fun. The interview I watched with her, and I don't know what year this interview was, but it would have been at least decades after the film came out. It was kind of one of those interviews where like, let's look back on Amityville Horror. And it was very clear that there was tension during her and Brolin when they were shooting this film, because the way that she talks about like just the, yeah, I took the job, it was fun, whatever, versus the way that Brolin was talking about, well, this was actually really challenging. I had to get into this mentality of this man who's, losing his mind. And it seemed quite indicative of how they would have really clashed on set in that way. And it seems like they did. They had quite a very different approach to acting. But I think that kind of works, though, because that tension, you need that tension, because the tension between Kathy and George is very much at the crux of this film, as this family is kind of falling apart because of all the, experiences they're having in the house. I mean, the film is interesting because you do open with the DeFeo murder. So from the get-go, they're like, this happened. So this is like, it's almost like they're basing the truth of the paranormal thing on the actual truth. Like they're hijacking the truth of that in a way, which I think is kind of grotesque, because it's overshadowed. If you think about it, you think of Amityville Horror, you think of the Amityville house, you don't think the DeFeo murders and this, these innocent lives that were taken. You think of like the crazy Jody pig or, whatever, blood down the walls. So we see the Lutzes moving into the house, Kathy's 3 children. This is, they've recently been married, but George Lutz is not the father to the children. And, he kind of like tries to play like with the, make it sound a bit scandalous to the real estate agent. And, which is, I guess, trying to show he's a bit jovial. He's a bit silly. He makes kind of little comments that are quite funny at the beginning, but he seems like, he's a charming guy. And we're setting him up, in that way. So George is not religious, but Kathy's a nominal Roman Catholic, so not in practice so much, but definitely grew up in the religion. And she requests Father Frank Delaney to bless the home. And so Delaney arrives while the family is out boating. He's upstairs and then he's like in a room and he can see the family outside and he's swarmed by flies. Like they're all over his face. It's like super grotesque. And he hears this hostile voice ordering him to leave. And then he flees because it's these terrifying events. And so the next day, Kathy's aunt Helena, who is a nun, visits the house and she becomes ill and leaves abruptly. So that's sort of like, you're like, something's not right with this house. We've got two figures from the church that are, having a very negative reaction to it. Then over the next few weeks, George starts to become uncharacteristically volatile and abusive. He's like obsessive about keeping the house warm and he keeps the fires going, even though Kathy keeps telling him it's not cold.
Yeah.
He starts to wake at 3:15 and it becomes recurrent. And that is the same time that the DeFeos were murdered. So there's this correlation between him waking up at the exact time the murders happened. And so then Kathy's brother, Jimmy, is having an engagement party and $1,500 cash just disappears, just goes missing. He came in with it. They can't find it. They're looking around. It's just gone. Then you have Jackie, the babysitter. She's locked inside a bedroom closet by an unseen force. One of the two boys suffers a crushed hand. The window just falls. He's got his hand in the windowsill and the window just falls and crushes his hand. And then you've got Amy, the daughter. She has an imaginary friend. She's called Jody. And it seems to be a very evil sort of figure, ominous kind of figure. Kathy glimpses two red swine-like eyes. There's this correlation between a pig, some kind of pig-like creature, and she sees it outside Amy's second-story bedroom window, and she's absolutely terrified. And then during all of this, you've got Delaney, the priest. He keeps trying to communicate with the Lutzes, so he's trying to call, but they're just not going through. It's either that he gets through and there's static, or it just doesn't. He keeps trying, it just never goes through, which is kind of interesting because she's like, "Hello," and he's telling her, and she's like, "Hello." It's like. It's great. I love it. Hello. So, of course, he does what any logical person does. He's like, okay, I can't get them on the phone. I'm going to get in the car and I'm going to drive and see them. But then his car malfunctions en route to the house. And so he can't even get there. It's like he's being kept away. George's business is starting to suffer because of all these changes in character that he's going through. And then in the basement, you have Carolyn, who is drawn to a brick wall that the family dog keeps sniffing at. He's scratching at it. And so she begins to dismantle it with a hammer. George sees the damage and he decides, okay, I'm going to take down the rest of the wall. And this is such an iconic moment. He takes down the wall and he uncovers these red walls. And then Carolyn shrieks and she says, "They've found the passage to hell." So it's a very big dramatic moment. And
I think it's so funny
dramatic.
with some of these, the haunting moments, because they're from a filming point of view, there are no. There's very few set piece expensive how did they do it with effect? It's his hand is ooh, I don't even see some of these things as being paranormal, right? Your house is drafty, you can't sleep through the night, you probably stole the money from your brother-in-law's engagement party because you're having all these money issues, your babysitter being locked in the bathroom or the closet. I'm well, maybe that was just one of your kids being annoying. And then the imaginary friend, kids have imaginary friends all the time. And then the static too, no. But sometimes I try to place a call and the call doesn't go through and you're like, what?
And it was interesting about the flies because I saw Kathy and George being interviewed, and the interviewer was asking, okay, but the flies happen in a house. Oh yeah, but not at this time of year. Well, okay. Well, did you call someone? And okay, about the
fly
walls.
trap.
Did you call a plumber? Did you call a professional?
But that is a good scene. That they do that. It is that's a very iconic. It's very memorable. It does kind of make your skin crawl to see it. It must have been kind of gnarly to film it.
For the actor to have the flies crawling all over him.
Yeah,
but yeah, so. So you've got this situation. Now we've got the passage to hell.
Yes.
And
yeah.
Delaney the priest, suddenly he loses his sight and he basically goes catatonic. The poor priest, he is, he's really, for a character that really just came in to bless the house, he's sort of got the worst end of it all.
There's not as much of like a sense of urgent, because they already are experiencing all the paranormal stuff. So by the
You're
time
so
you're
right.
like through the film, for him to be like, there's paranormal things happening, they're like, I know.
Well, thanks.
Totally.
I guess the idea is maybe he would have some kind of like next steps for them.
I don't think he did, though. The guy couldn't even get a phone call through. I don't know what he
He's
was
like,
going
one
to say.
step at a time, guys.
He couldn't even beat the landline. I'm not sure what he was going to do. But
yeah, I do like the okay, I'm just going to get in my car. Nope, that's not going to work either.
That's not going to work. And he's like so struggling. The poor guy. He's kind of like the main victim of this whole situation, really. So poor guy falls catatonic. And then Kathy has this moment where she's obviously like, my husband's going crazy. All this stuff is happening. So she decides to go to the library, because back in the day, you couldn't just be like, let me Google this. She had to go to the library to research the property's history. And she's like looking through the county records. So she sees that the records suggest that maybe the house was built atop a Shinnecock burial ground, and also that a known satanic worshiper named John Ketchum had once lived on the land. And then she sees these news clippings about the DeFeo murders, and it's like an eerily similar, striking resemblance from Ronald DeFeo to George, to the point that it's like, is it Brolin or is it his brother? I don't remember, but I think they actually I know they used Brolin's brother at a certain point. That might have been that particular where they got Brolin's brother to like wear a beard, and because he looks so similar to him. But yeah,
and he's like gone on his like, his eyes are red, his hair is all disheveled, he's like looking transformed. It's like The Shining. He's like gone off the deep end.
It's exactly what is so like The Shining in that regard. It's like, oh, he's really transformed into this person that's committed these murders, and now he's potentially capable of doing what DeFeo did. And then, of course, we have this moment during a rainstorm. We've got blood oozing from the walls down the staircase, Jody appearing as the large red-eyed pig seen through the window, and then suddenly a possessed George attempts to try kill the children with an axe, which again really does kind of give us that here's Johnny kind of moment. So you have that George Lutz moment trying to get into I think it's there in the bathroom, aren't they? And he's trying to get in, and Kathy's trying to save the children, and he is so close to killing her. And then he just has a moment where he sort of switches back to George, and he's like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? And then they're like, okay, we got to get out of this place. And so he falls through the basement stairs into a pit of black sludge while rescuing Harry. And George and the rest of the family drive, abandoning their home and their belongings, as one does, because, you can't go back because this place is crazy. And then we have a intertitle at the end that says, George and Kathleen Lutz and their family never reclaimed their house or their personal belongings. Today they live in another state. And that's what we're led to believe. This is true. This happened. That's it. We're done.
And I mean, even from the point of view of trying to like run out on your mortgage, you're really committing to the bit to be like, leave all the stuff, just leave it, let's just go.
I do want to say though, I saw this interview at it was like I don't know, it was some kind of like almost like a Comic-Con type thing, but not a Comic-Con, like some kind of convention. George Lutz happened to be there, and somebody was interviewing him, and they asked him, well, did you ever go back to the house? And he said, I don't like to talk about that. And then he sort of says, we did go back once. And I'm like, I bet you went back and got the things you needed. And yeah, you didn't get the boat because the bank took the boat, didn't they, George?
Yeah. Yeah.
I just love it. Like, we never went back. Oh, we maybe did. I don't like to talk about it.
That's actually very traumatic for you to ask about. How dare you? Like, yeah. It's a very good cover story if that's what we're, that's what we're here to discuss.
They never
Was
went
the house haunted?
Well, okay, so that's something I wanted to now bring up, which is like going back to the idea of the tagline, for God's sakes, get out. So, I mean, I think that is a very common question that we ask when watching horror movies, especially haunted house movies. And I actually did do a bit of a deep dive on this, and I wanted to shout out Laura Alyssa Springman, who did a thesis called Haunted Homes and Restless Ghosts, Invisible Structures of Power and Violence in American Haunted House Films, that I found fascinating. And she does talk about, like, when you're watching these movies, the thing that might come to mind is, why did they just leave? Why are they sticking around in this haunted place? Why did they leave earlier, before their children's fingers got crushed and the dog almost died and all that too?
Like, where
and
do
that
you
is
draw
a common
the line?
question. Yeah, like, and that is, I mean, my students joke about it too, like when we're watching The Birds, and Melanie in the middle of the night hears
God, I
them in
love
the
The Birds.
attic. So she goes up the stairs.
Why
and
does
you're
she
like,
go
"Mel-
up the stairs?
Why?
Right?
Wake up, Mitch, and tell him I think there's a bird in the house and get the hell out of there." Like, that's what you're
I
supposed
know.
to do. Or that's kind of what our natural instinct is. But she talks about how, like, we have to consider the ability to move and exist safely are privileges that are tied to class and money. And the truth is they couldn't afford it. At the end of the day, the only way they could afford it was to, make up this story and get out of the mortgage. But it is, a lot of these movies kind of mimic this idea of, you get kind of stuck in this home with maybe a predatory landlord, or your hands are tied, and they can't leave. And that is, like, on a more kind of social level. Like, you talked about how horror movies have all this social anxiety in them. And I'm like, yeah, like, we sometimes do get trapped in our housing situations. And that's what's also horrifying, is that you're living with a ghost and you're like, but I can't afford to find a new place. It's like, that is sad in and of itself, that Americans get stuck in their homes, and maybe it is haunted, but because of economic reasons, they can't leave. But going back to the house that supposedly he did go back to. Even though
He can't talk about that, Molly.
He can't talk about it.
Doesn't
But
talk about that.
I did want to talk about, did they shoot in the house? What was the use of locations in this film, considering they were potentially available? It was
Right.
a real place.
They
Yeah.
wanted to. They absolutely wanted to, but the residents, the owners of the house, actually declined them permission. So the house has actually had numerous people live in it over the decades. From something I read, that the first owners that had it after the Lutzes, they didn't stay very long, and the reason for that was not because of paranormal, but because people kept knocking on the door all hours of the night, trying, so there's no peace, and it's not
Yeah.
ghosts, it's human. Lutz says, houses don't have memories. That's what he says at the beginning of the film when they're discussing whether or not to buy. But of course, then the whole point is being like, well, the house does remember and it's full of evil. But, in this case, no. The house is just a house, and it did have a terrible event happen, but so much has changed. And they did actually, like nowadays, they've completely changed the address. People, owners have changed the address. They got rid of the iconic, like, windows that, like, in the attic windows. They've changed that. And, because that obviously after the film was so, everybody wanted to go and get a photo of these windows. So people would just show up, and it was a whole thing. And so, no, the residents at the time, when they asked, can we shoot here? They were like, no, thank you. Like, they'd had enough attention. So instead they went to Toms River, New Jersey, and they started filming on location there in October 1978. And they actually chose a Dutch colonial home that was quite kind of similar, and then they converted it to resemble the actual Amityville residence.
I feel like it's creepier. I feel like the house they used is, like, actually, like, when you look at the photos of the real house, it looks
Yeah.
kind of more just like innocuous, like a suburban house. And they found one. I
True.
mean, that's the advantage you have when you're, like, location scouting. You're like, what is the creepiest looking house that has some kind
And
of
it's
weird
interesting
vibe?
because it starts becoming your cinematic memory of, like, well, that's the house, and it's like, actually,
Right.
that's not the house. So it sort of
Yeah.
becomes a thing where it all plays into the lore of it all. So the
Right.
house that they leased by production, they leased it for $12,000, and they actually constructed a boat house on the property for an additional $31,000. So they were very, the boathouse, they had to have that. That was kind of a part of the whole thing as well, because George would say he would always go out at midnight to check that the boathouse was locked. I don't know why. Why would you do that? I've got to check the boathouse is locked at midnight. Like, okay, George, sure thing. So additional exteriors were shot at Tom Rivers Riverwood Park Recreation Center, at the Ocean County Courthouse, and Reynolds Tavern. And actually, local police and ambulance workers played extras in the film, and the Toms River Volunteer Fire Company provided the rain during several scenes, so it was a real community event. And then the library scene was filmed at the Bishop Building of the Ocean County Library. I read that Brolin actually wanted to be trained by a local axe thrower, because he throws the axe, like it's kind of interesting. He really wanted to get into character. Like, I just love the idea that Kidder's like, whatever, well, this was a laugh, and then like Brolin's like, I've got to train and get this right. After the completion of the location shooting, they relocated to Los Angeles, and they did interiors and shot at the MGM studio lot, and then they completed the filming on December 22, 1978. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of sorry to say it did not happen at the real house. The real house is just a house where people have lived on and off for the last, however many decades. So it's just, that's it. Just a house, guys. Sorry to ruin the mystique.
So then I guess the YouTube vloggers must be really conflicted. Do they go to the real house, or did they go to the house where they filmed it?
Well, it's funny. I remember trying to Google image the house, and it's blurred on because they changed the address, but it's obviously so easy to find the new one. And when I remember looking it up and trying to find it, and it's like when you go a street view, it's completely blurred. So they've managed to even do that, so people can't just get a Google view of it. But yeah, I mean, I don't think they'd be that excited, because it's not. When you look at pictures of the house, it's actually really lovely inside. They sold it. They had it up for sale. I don't know how recent it was, but it was in the last 20 years. They had it up for sale, and you could see inside all the renovations that they'd done and everything. And you can see photos online of the actual house, like the police took right after the crimes. So you do get a sense of what the house was at that time compared to it. And it's just, it's so different that if you walked into that house, I know that James Brolin said that they actually did go back and do an interview, I believe, with Ed and Lorraine Warren. They did a sort of a thing at the house after or during the promotion of the film. I can't recall when it came about, but he said he was surprised by how much smaller it was. Like, in his mind, I guess he'd built it up in some way, but it was a lot smaller than more compact, he said. So, but I mean, yeah, that's it. Just the house.
And you did mention, we talked about The Flies earlier. So, I mean, this was made in 1979. This was the era of practical special effects. It was kind of a special time for the horror movie, in that things were still being done practically. It's still just as effective. Like, it is is CGI, is it made horror movies more scary or less? I mean, it's up for debate. But as we were saying earlier, it's kind of nice to have it done practically. And
I think so.
Yeah. So could you expand? Is there any information you discovered about the effects?
I think what's really fun to know is that when they shot the scene with the flies with Father Delaney, that they were real flies, and they actually put stuff on his face, kind of a mix of sugar, water, honey, anything they could do to attract the flies. So in that scene where you get that kind of close up, and he's clearly grossed out, because in reality these flies are crawling all over his face. So that scene is really iconic, I think, because of that practical element. You would not, in today's world, we would just CG those flies in, add them in post, but the actor's experience would not be the same versus this poor actor that's okay, it's happening.
I just love the idea of the fly wrangler that comes to set and is all right, I've got my professional
release.
Flies here. Yeah. And
not have
action,
been fun,
guys.
That would not have been fun.
And how do we get them back in, guys? Someone just comes in with rage, I got them.
No, these are highly paid animal actors, Kelly.
Come back, guys. And close. End scene.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that scene was really, it's quite well known for that fact that you've got that practical effect of these real flies on this poor man's face.
And the walls bleeding, all of that's what sticks with you after you've seen the film. And it doesn't need to be done by CGI. I think some of these movies are so classic and iconic because of these practical special effects. I was going to mention something about Rod Steiger, just because I really didn't like the character of Father Delaney. I was not a fan of the scenes that featured him. And it seems like Janet Maslin of the New York Times was also not a fan. She talks about how he really just overdid it. He bellows and weeps and overdoes absolutely everything. He won't even pick up the phone before it's rung 12 or 15 times.
That's my normal wait time. On that 15th ring, I'm good to go.
I would say him and also James Brolin, they're a little overwrought. I think with horror movies, sometimes less can be more with performances. Just like how, again, like less effects, but that can be more powerful in a way at the end of the day. So I would say that some of the performances were a little cringy for me while watching this.
I thought James Brolin could have had a more subtle arc. I feel like it's like he goes from like 0 to 100. It's like he's like making some jokes in the very beginning and seems kind of cool, and then like immediately is like crazy with the eyes. Like angry. I feel like shout out to Jack Nicholson for The Shining, because I feel like that's a more like you're like, is something happening? And then by the end you're like, oh, he's fully like gone crazy. But I feel like it was like pretty much like right away. He like steps into the house and then the eyes are red and the hair is crazy. And
to have the whole family get away and the dog unscathed. Well, except
it's
for the broken fingers, I guess. But
because they did, right? Because nothing. I mean, that's the thing about this film. Nobody dies. Apart from the DeFeo true crime murders that actually happen, nobody dies in this film. Like, it's so different from normal horror films.
Well, I guess Delaney loses his sight forever. So.
Delaney loses a lot. He should never have gone to blast that house.
Well, and at the same time, there isn't really like a monster. Like there isn't an actual like antagonist. Like there's sort of like the forces of the house, but that doesn't like take a form either, right? Like so there isn't like this.
It's not like if you go like The Others, you know, the Nicole Kidman film.
Oh yeah, that's great.
That is so creepy, and it has a wonderful twist, which I won't give away because if you haven't seen it, you have to watch The Others. Because you have that component of like the house is haunted to like moving to more of a character kind of moment. Whereas in this, it's just the house and George is crazy. Well, maybe if George goes away for a little bit, he'll be fine. You know, George can just go have a vacation. You'll be right. But like, you know, as you said earlier, Molly, it's not that easy to just like leave the house. And so they were in this situation, the Lutzes, where they'd overspent. Did they know that going in? What was the intention? So yeah, but I will say, yeah, the performances were very dramatic. But I think it's one of those things where I remember when I was rewatching it, because I'd seen it a long time ago. Then I'd seen the 2005 one that had Melissa George and Ryan Reynolds in it, which was absolutely terrible. And rewatching this one, I had to kind of keep putting myself in the mindset of like, it's 1979, you know, like it's a different time. Whereas like I remember going to the cinema and watching Scream when, you know, we suddenly had this kind of resurgence of the horror in the 90s. And then since then, it has just been like a steady diet of like horror, paranormal, psycho thrillers. We've seen it all. That it's hard to get scared now. You kind of have seen all the gimmicks and the things. So watching it, I had to kind of be like, okay, the audience wouldn't necessarily have had all of that in their minds. They wouldn't have seen the same things, especially if they're coming out of like the 50s, which you have like The Blob and, you know, like a different take on the horror film. But I just sort of had to kind of keep reminding myself that, you know, like, it is different. And I saw a Reddit thread where people were saying like, I remember watching that film and it absolutely terrified me. And that's the thing. It's like, oh, this lives in the memory of some people as like a terrifying film that they saw when they were young.
For those who do find this to be terrifying, let's try to assuage those fears. Let's try to alleviate that by sharing what exactly is true or not about what we see depicted in the film. Do we need to be afraid of our walls seeping out black fluid and windows crushing our fingers? Like, what is actually based?
I mean, if windows are crushing your fingers, you got to get those windows fixed. That's just a hazard. In one of the interviews that I saw where they were interviewing the real Kathy and George Lutz, and he asked about that. Well, you know, what about the blood? Well, it wasn't to the extent that it was in the film. I'm like, oh, okay. So it wasn't oozing down. So maybe you saw a little bit of, I don't know, rust when it gets wet can kind of look like blood. I'm just saying. Like, Kidda said, I didn't buy that any of this had really happened. And in a 2005 interview, she said that. And she said that during the press junkets promoting the film, when they were asked whether, they believed the Lutz's claims, she would say, like, oh, we'll never tell. Like, the producers would sort of like, oh, it's, like they're just trying to, obviously no one was believing it, but they were like, we've got to keep up the allure of it because that's the whole thing. Like, you're selling the idea of it. But yeah, Kidda said, the producers told us to say all these terrible things happened on set. It was all bullshit. Nothing happened, but it was funny. So it's like her whole approach to it was like, it was a bit of a laugh. And then you have this situation on Good Morning America. And they actually have James Brolin there with George and Kathy Lutz. And David Hartman asked James Brolin on the same couch as these two, do you believe them? And James is like, when I'm sitting here with them, yes, I do. and then he says, I can't say I believe the book as it's presented. I think I shared with you both the actual, there was like a video of the actual Red Room in the house. And it was a friend, Patty, a friend of Alison DeFeo, who was murdered and she's one of the victims of the murders. And she shows them the real Red Room because she grew up there and played with the children. And it's actually just a storage room. It's behind a door. It's, you go in and it's just a storage room that had like red walls. It was just a little area that they used to play with their toys. And that became this like Red Room, this whole thing. So the accuracy is that the Lutzes lived there. A murder happened there. And then they left after like a really short amount of time, Lutz said that he thinks that James Brolin did a great job. He said the book was much more accurate and the movie is a movie. And then he said this, I love this quote. He said, there were some movies that were done that were not authorized, and that was a 13-year lawsuit. He just kind of added that. That was a 13-year lawsuit. Like, just threw that out there like he's been fight. So it just goes to show like he has been part of this machine for a very long time. Like the minute the Lutzes left the house, they did not leave Amityville behind. In fact, it was sort of the start for them, I think, of a kind of money-making concoction. And that's at least where I stand with it.
I think we're in agreement. As we've said, a lot of this wasn't true. Was the house built on an Indian burial ground? No. Did the priest who visited experience anything paranormal? No. Joe Nickel, the author of Entities, Angels, Spirits, Demons, and Other Alien Beings, who actually visited Amityville and interviewed later owners of the house, he had a few examples of specific things that were not true. They could not have found a demonic hoof print in the snow because the weather records proved that it was not snowing at the time. Even though the book, this is what we were sort of saying with the house with like, oh, the blood. Well, maybe it wasn't like as extreme blood as it showed in the movie, but there was definitely some blood. There was like no damage to this house, like severe damage in terms of like reselling. Like the doors weren't ripped open. There was no axe damage. The window that apparently crushed the kid's hand, there was nothing wrong with any of that. And then another point that I think is also interesting, Molly, you were talking about like, okay, it's a haunted house. Why don't you just leave? Right. On the flip side, another question that I think we ask a lot of horror movies is like, why don't you call the police? Like, there's many reasons why you may not want to call the police. But in terms of them being like, we were completely terrified and we had to leave and never come back because it was so awful and horrible. Not once did you think to get the cops to come and like check out, like, you would think maybe somewhere along that 28-day period you would...
not even, they didn't call a plumber. They didn't call, like, suppose all the stuff was coming out. They didn't call a plumber. They didn't call an electrician. They didn't call anyone who had a specialty that could look at the wiring and go, you're good. But yeah. Didn't call anyone.
And you would think if you were actually terrified too, that would be like a good step to be like, okay, we're spiraling here. Okay, we're in a house. The house is fine. We just need like a plumber to come and tell us that like there's nothing wrong with it. This isn't an actual paranormal toilet. This is just a normal toilet that has some kind of plumbing issue, right? Like you'd think that would be like comforting. And it seems very much like they didn't want somebody to show up and like confirm what was happening. So yeah, in terms of the sort of backstory with the book is kind of shitty because the lawyer for Butch DeFeo was involved, and obviously they stood to benefit from perpetuating this idea of the house being possessed because they could use it as defense. Like, he was claiming insanity. Oh, he was living in this like horrible house that was full of paranormal activity. Look at how crazy George Lutz went. oh, that is exactly what happened to poor Butch, is that he like was driven mad by the demons of the house and forced to commit murder. So that's why the William Weber, who was Butch's defense lawyer, was kind of involved in all of this. And it was him who later said that the Lutzes and himself created the story over many bottles of wine, quote.
Wow.
So, yeah. And in terms of, did they make money from it? Yes, they stuck to their story. They made tens of thousands of dollars from the book as well as the film rights. And in court, George Lutz admitted that he had netted $100,000 from the film. So yes, they very much stood to benefit from this. And that's
100%.
probably why they were perpetuating the hoax, as we have sort of determined that it was.
It makes you wonder. It just makes you wonder, like, what did they go in with a plan? Did they go, like, when did...
that's my theory.
Your theory is they went
in. They went in specifically knowing that they could take it and bail on it and use that as an excuse. Although, I've heard other people, like, say that they think that they were genuinely, like, afraid of something. So I don't know, maybe it was just sort of like bad vibes. But in terms of like these, there's very little that they can actually like prove in terms of these things that they're claiming. Yeah.
But I mean, but when we look at the film, it did do very well. I mean,
which is funny. It did well, and yet critics hated it.
Critics hated it. Like Roger Ebert gave it 1.5 stars out of a possible 4. I like the half. I'm not sure, but just give a little half there. And he said that he'd actually Roger Ebert said he briefly met George Lutz and found his account sincere, but described the film as a dreary and terminally depressing, writing that the problem with the Amityville Horror is that in a very real sense, there's nothing there. I think that's kind of interesting because it's actually not inaccurate. Like when you watch the film, you're like, what am I supposed to be afraid of? Who am I supposed to care for? I don't really care for George Lutz. I don't really care for the family.
I care about
that
the dog. Okay. I never want to see an animal.
100%.
Who cares about George? Whatever. Just get the dog out alive.
They try to make you care about the priest. I don't care about the priest. I don't care about this. I'm like, it's weird. I didn't know who to care. And I felt like the whole thing, I'm like, I don't know who I'm supposed to be rooting for. Do I root for the house? I mean, I don't know. So it cost $4.7 million, grossed $86.4 million. That is huge.
That's a good profit. That's a very good profit.
Major commercial success. One of the most profitable films for its distributor, which was American International Pictures. It was actually one of the highest grossing independent films of all time. It held that record until 1990 when it was surpassed by Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which I thought was really interesting. And it's actually one of the highest grossing horror films in cinema history, even though it was largely met with unfavorable critical reviews.
Horror maybe being critically, critics don't like it, but audiences do. Like horror is one of the oldest film genres. It emerged in the silent filmmaking era, unlike, the musical, which emerged in sound. It's been with us for a while, and it's kind of had certain, times when it was more popular than others. So like some of the first horror movies we can see in like German Expressionism, right? Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Nosferatu, which was essentially an early adaptation of Dracula. In terms of it becoming an American thing, though, it's kind of tricky because, like, we did have a few, like, I don't know if you've heard of, I think it's called Cat People, that came out in the 40s. Yep. We, of course, had film noir, which has some of the German Expressionist influence, the angular, performances, the heavy makeup, the distorted settings. We do see that in film noir in America as well. But I would maybe kind of point to, we mentioned him earlier, Hitchcock. I think he was really the one that brought horror to America. And if we're looking at the haunted house film, well, Psycho. Of course, the iconic shower scene, many people say is like kind of the beginning of the slasher. I would say the soundtrack of Amityville is very reminiscent of the Psycho.
It's honestly like, it's hard to not think of it as like a plagiarization of it because Lalo Schifrin, who did it, he composed Amityville Horror, and then you've got Nat Herman, who composed Psycho. But like, that's an iconic sound. Like, it's like Jaws. You hear it, you know exactly what you're looking at. And then you hear it in the film, it's like Psycho. So you can't really tell me like, oh, it was just no, it's just similar. But I'm like, no, it had to be. I mean, I couldn't find
similar.
I couldn't find anything that was like he took it deliberately, but maybe it was just a bit of a nod, to the piece. I'm not sure because he said that his whole inspiration with the soundtrack was about, like, the children and making, like, a haunted, distorted lullaby for the children's voices, so that was kind of interesting, but the Psycho thing was very, like, "That's Psycho. That's the
Yeah.
sound from Psycho," so but
Well,
sure, okay.
Janet Maslin took issue again with the film's potential. Do we call it plagiarism or is it just inspiration? But she said, so many horror movie cliches have been assembled under the roof of a single haunted house that the effect is sometimes mind-bogglingly messy. And I'm like, yeah, I do see what she means. If you are a fan of the genre, you definitely would have been picking up on it. Like even Night of the Living Dead, right? So we cut ahead to the 1960s. After Psycho, horror was becoming this low-budget, independent thing. And I mean, as we said already, Amityville was a independent productions as well. Even Night of the Living Dead, well, that was a house for the most part of that movie. They're stuck in a house with zombies trying to come in, and it was really, really low budget. But then teenagers, as we said earlier, college students saw it and they freaked out about it. But I mean, obviously the film that really kind of started off the 70s cycle was The Exorcist. And that film is where we really saw that the violence, the disgustingness, Reagan vomiting in the face of a priest. This was a new standard. And Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, those also fed into the satanic panic that was going to come in the 80s. So we already had this idea of, violence and like houses or families that are not quite right was already going on. And then, of course, Halloween came out a year before Amityville. That was 1978. But really, it was the 80s. I'm now quoting like the textbook I use for 101, like the horror film entered into a period of popularity in the 80s that has not yet ended, which I think is an interesting statement because you said, yeah, in the 90s we had the parody horror films. And then even today, I think horror is bigger than ever before.
I think that it's the genre that speaks to social anxiety the most. So, when you look at the 1950s, you have a lot of things like The Blob, and there's a lot of creature horror films, and we're looking at something from another planet, something from another space coming into our suburban life, and they're trying to threaten us and what's happening in society at the time. You have the Cold War, you have the Reds under the bed scare, and I think it played into that. And then you move into the 70s, and what was happening in the 70s, you actually had a lot of serial killers in the 70s. 1950s, you've got all these kids growing up with their parents who come back from war, their fathers who are suffering from PTSD. There was just so much going on in society at the time. You had these 70s slasher horror films that came out. You move forward to early 2000s and you have the Afghanistan war, and suddenly you've got a lot of like what I would call the torture porn film came out, where there's a lot of like Saw and things where people are in situations where they're like being tortured. And that seemed to come about when we started to hear also these horrible stories of these kinds of prison camps that were coming out around
Guantanamo Bay, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, for example, yeah.
So I just have always associated like horror is always going to speak to the anxieties of society at the time. It's the genre that I think just does that the best.
And it's a way of like working out those anxieties because it's not specifically about, we just did Body Snatchers in my Hollywood class. It's about aliens taking over your body. But no, it's also a way of looking at McCarthyism, right?
Exactly.
And it's a lens through which we can view these issues. And in maybe a more safe kind of a way, like we're going to work it out because it's not about it, but it also kind of is. If that makes sense.
Yeah. And then you have like Amityville Horror. I mean, like the cost of a house to maintain a house. This house, $1,500 just goes disappearing. It's an interesting kind of idea of like, oh, the money is like the house, is like absorbing the money. It's taking, So that sort of plays into it as well. Like there's kind of this housing, you mentioned it earlier, Molly, this kind of like expense, this housing kind of anxiety, and it plays out quite a lot in this film. So is it a true story? No, but the social context of it, the anxiety is true.
Because again, what was going on then in 1979? Well, earlier in the 70s, we had like the worst economic depression since the Great Depression in America. The 70s was a wild time. You mentioned too, like PTSD in World War II. Well, the 70s, we had Vietnam veterans. We also had the televisization of the Vietnam War. Americans had an immediate visual connection to their losses over in Vietnam. We had a lot of violence in horror movies in the 70s, but there's a lot of violence on television. Violence that was real, that was coming from Vietnam. We can criticize the performances, right? And maybe, the effects feel dated for people that are used to CGI and whatnot, but the actual social issues, the anxiety that it speaks to, you're right, Kelly, is very true. So Tony Williams also echoes King's analysis in a book he wrote called Hearths of Darkness, The Family in the American Horror Film. And he wrote that there is this sort of association between family life, home ownership, and supposedly supernatural horror. And it's one of the few films, Amityville, to link the economic responsibilities of home ownership to family horror. And I mean, we also mentioned that Margot Kidder's character, Kathy, well, she is a divorced woman. Divorce was on the rise too in the 1970s. You could say that's another thing that this film is speaking to. It's not just home or haunted house horror, it's horror within the family itself. And we see that happen in a lot of other movies, especially that came out later in the 80s. I think some of these films too, we could mention, have this cult following, and that they're not maybe the best made films. They're bad movies, but that's what makes them so popular. There was a whole class on cult cinema that Ernest taught at UBC, right, Kelly? And badness, I remember, was one of the features of a cult film. We do tend to celebrate films that might be bad. Halloween is an excuse to sit down and watch some horror movies. And often I like to watch movies I've already seen. So folks, if there is a movie that you like rewatching around Halloween, put it in our comments. Let us know. Thanks for joining us today. If you have any suggestions for films we should discuss in upcoming episodes, send us an email at thismightbetruepodcast@gmail.com. You can also leave a comment below. You can find us on Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, at This Might Be True Podcast. Please subscribe and join us next time to find out what else might be true.